most policies that are rooted in restorative justice face a lot of opposition nowadays because people are sort of afraid that they're gonna enable, in a way, more crime. So I'm joined today by Joshua Ho, who is the host of Decarceration Nation, a podcast which focuses on criminal justice reform in the US and punishment in general and how it affects people. And by David Ryan Castro Harris, who's gonna be taking us on a theoretical introduction to restorative justice, the concepts behind it, and will hopefully illuminate how we can apply these concepts both on a micro level in our personal lives and within the criminal justice system. So in terms of housekeeping, the webinar will be debuting with an interview with Josh. We're going to be talking about his former experiences as an inmate and how it inspired his current work and on raising awareness on crime and punishment in the US. Then David is going to take us on a mini lecture on restorative justice practices, theoretical concepts. And after that, we're going to have a more interactive discussion with David and hopefully Josh, who will be still with us then, on some of the concepts that were discussed during the lecture part. And you will also have the opportunity to ask David and Josh questions then as well. We're also going to be trying to do more interactive part on creating a restorative justice tree, something that David is going to talk about in his lecture part. And we're going to try to sort of see how we can anchor this sort of concept and policy framework in harm reduction based drug policies. So if our speakers could introduce themselves and their work, that would be great. David, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me, Yulia, and hello to everyone, whether you're tuning in from somewhere in the UK or like me in the US or anywhere around the world. Really good to be here with you. My name is David Ryan, Barcega, Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors. I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. We're a digital platform that's dedicated to raising awareness about restorative justice philosophy, values, and practices. Really just excited to be here to be able to share with you all and listen to Josh and hear his story about how this work has been formative for him. So looking forward to talking to y'all in just a bit after Josh. I'm going to go off camera until then, but looking forward to talking to y'all. You're still on mute, Yulia. Yulia, you're still on mute.
Oh, sorry, guys. We still have technical issues. So, well, technical issues meaning I'm not that good with technology. But yeah, Josh, if you could introduce yourself, your experience with criminal justice, and how it inspired your current work, that would be great.
Yeah, so I'm formerly incarcerated and the host of a podcast called Decarceration Nation, which is available on any podcast platform from iTunes to Spotify, wherever you look. And I also am a policy analyst at Safe and Just Michigan, where I work to try to work with legislature in Michigan to change laws, to try to help reform our criminal justice system here in Michigan, which is in the United States. I really didn't become active particularly because of my crime. It was more because of everything that I saw when I went through the system here in the United States. As a white, relatively privileged and educated person, it was pretty shocking to see the difference between what the system here purports to be and what actually happens. And I usually tell the immediate story I usually tell is that I remember being in right outside of a courtroom for one of the first times in real life. Everybody sees them on television or in the movies, but it's quite a different thing when you're going to go into them. And I'm looking at the docket, which is stapled up against the wall. And I noticed that, a single public defender would have up to 30 cases in one day. And that started, my whole journey through courts and jails and prisons and parole. And in every one of the stops that I made, I'd be more and more just flabbergasted, gobsmacked by what I saw. And it kind of created in me a real desire that when I got out, I would do everything I could to try to be part of changing that system. And that's pretty much what I do now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So going from that, based on your personal experience and what you've seen when you were incarcerated, can you tell me more about the main punitive approaches that are employed in US prisons, and how do you think it has a long-term impact on the development of inmates?
Well, I think the first thing I should say, and it'll sound corrective, but I don't really mean it that way. It's just one of the really nice things about dialogue on things like this is it allows us all to kind of come to common understandings of things. And one thing that we really are working hard to try to stop is this notion of defining people entirely by being in prison or being criminalized or whatever. So for instance, words like felon and inmate, we really try not to use. We might say person who is incarcerated. I think the idea is to try to always use person first language in order to humanize the person, so that when you're having a conversation, you don't look at them as either an object or as only the thing that you're saying is tied to the criminal system. And so, that's kind of one thing to start with. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but every single news story here in the United States will use terms that are pejorative and that entirely define people only by the worst things they've done, as opposed to seeing them as a full person. For instance, when there was a riot in South Carolina because of incredibly poor conditions a few years ago, and when 8 people died, the press didn't even publish anything about them aside from their crimes. They were literally, even in death, wholly defined only by the worst thing that they'd ever done. No one asked their family members, no one asked anyone they knew anything about them to give color or commentary or anything or full picture of that person. And that's a lot of what we're trying to fight against, is this notion that you can wholly define people only by crimes. To your larger question, I think one of the biggest problems, there are kind of 2 major problems. The first one is that people in the United States have tied the idea of incarceration or corrections entirely to punishment. The idea that you're being not just rehabilitated, but punished for a crime. And there's a lot of ways that that's played out. And a lot of them end up creating a lot of violence and problems within the system. For instance, you don't go into prison with money, but everything in prison costs money. You don't go into prison with food, and yet there's hardly any food, and it's very bad food. And so there's a lot of resource competition built into the system. And so people start out from a place of scarcity where they're literally competing for a very scarce amount of goods. That's not a very good formula for creating a peaceful place. You have very little space, you have very little stuff, you don't have much food, and you don't have any money. And to change any of that, you have to compete with other people. And so from here's an example, like for most of my time in prison, I was incarcerated in prisons that were considered to be level 3s, which were the lowest level. Sounds counterintuitive. I'm sorry, level 1s, which are the lowest level. And despite that, the way they were set up is we would live in pole barns, which are like large, warehouses, where 160 people would basically live in an open space in multiple bunk beds. And so we were literally herded in there in a way like cattle. And So the whole structure of how the system is set up more for denying people basic necessities, and then people, obviously being human beings, are forced to compete for those necessities, and you see it throughout the entire system. Trauma is a daily event. You know, like I said, I was at a level 1 prison, and even at a level 1 prison, I saw violence almost every day. At the last correctional facility I was at, the Robert Cotton facility in Michigan, there would rarely be 2 days that went by without some kind of violence occurring.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you tell me a bit more about the sort of impact it has on inmates once they become free, this sort of treatment, and also whether you think that this analogy between the prison system and the former system of slavery is something that you would personally see in terms of conditions and treatment of people within the prison system?
I mean, you would have to be willfully blind to walk into a jail or prison in the United States and not immediately see the racial disparities. You know, a lot of what our prison system developed from this kind of in a reaction to the end of slavery. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's a common thread that runs through from our history through to our present, and that unfortunately impacts people of color a great deal more than anyone else. It's bad for everyone in there, but people are disproportionately incarcerated because or as a result of being a person of color, and that is intensely problematic. And like I said, it would be impossible to walk in, look around, and not realize that when African Americans, for instance, are 13% of our population, and up to 70% of the prison population, that's not, that's a fairly large amount of systemic discrimination. And so I think we need to make sure that we address that. Yeah, what was the first part of your question? I'm sorry, Julia.
So how do you think this affected long-term people that have been former inmates and now are free? How do you think are they able to reintegrate into society? Do you think they're less susceptible to recidivism?
I would say that the short answer is no. Most apartment complexes in the United States discriminate against formerly incarcerated people. A huge number of employers in the United States discriminate against formerly incarcerated people. Communities often organize against formerly incarcerated people. I've actually gone to community events where they hear that some housing project or something is going to change their policy, and they turn out in droves to suggest that that they don't want people who are formerly incarcerated to move into their areas. And the press often participates in in promoting these scare tactics about formerly incarcerated people. And the really sad truth of the whole thing is that the biggest drivers of recidivism are poverty, lack of housing, and lack of community connections. And so without a job, without a place to live, without being able to take care of your family or even have good connections with people in your community, you really are being told by society that, we don't want you and we don't want to include you in what we're doing. And so it's really not a surprise that people end up recidivating. Hopefully what we do through the work that we do in criminal justice reform and through things like restorative justice is start to create healing and forgiveness and the ability to bring people back into communities and the ability to reintegrate people with some kind of compassion and empathy instead of kind of leaving them totally bereft of any ability to look after themselves or become productive members of their communities.
Do you think that from your personal experience, your time in prison, do you think it had a positive impact on you in terms of the possibility, the prospect of committing crimes? Or would you think if there were other systems in place, focus more on rehabilitation? Do you think you would have benefited more from that, and how?
I mean, I'm kind of a weird case because I had resources going in. I am white. I had a good education. I had been working for a really long time, and it was still incredibly hard for me when I came back. I would certainly say that I was really lucky in some other ways. I got access to some therapy when I first got into the system, and before I got into the system, and after I got into the system, that really was helpful. In addition, I could see, because I'd already had a certain level of success in my life, the difference between where I had been and where I was then. And so I could do a lot of reflecting, and I could start planning in a way that I'm not sure everybody always has a chance to do. So I think I was in a kind of unique situation, but in my experience with other people, prison and incarceration should be at the absolute, if we agree or disagree on if it should exist, I personally tend toward the side that it isn't very positive for people. It should be basically tailored towards good outcomes. And right now it's mostly tailored toward keeping people and stigmatizing them. And so we really need to move, I think, to different frameworks for how we envision whatever incarceration is.
Why do you think that, despite the need to sort of move towards more rehabilitative, restorative justice focused frameworks, why do you think legislators and policymakers are still very much determined to be tough on crime? And for example, if we look at death penalty in the US, we see that more and more prosecutors, especially in the South, sort of want to have more death penalty sentences because it appears as if they are tough on crime. Why do you think there is still this need to be tough on crime?
Yeah, in the United States, this is called the Willie Horton effect. And basically the short answer is politics. A lot of politicians often don't see that the benefits of helping formerly incarcerated people have the same electoral impact that a single bad press story about an act of recidivism has. So, to them, all they see is risk in criminal justice reform, and they only see benefit from being tough on crime. Now, I will say this is changing to some extent. I have been part of I was a part of the movement to get the First Step Act passed, which was a federal piece of legislation that passed in 2018. I've been part of a lot of legislative efforts here in Michigan that have passed, everything from raised age to objective parole to a bunch of things that are happening now in terms of expungement. So there are counter narratives that are starting to take hold, and there's a progressive prosecutor movement that's growing in the United States to bring a whole different type of prosecutor into office. As to the death penalty, I mean, it's one of the saddest parts of our system, because not only is it applied in racially disparate manners, not only has it been found to be, a lot of people have been found to be innocent who were on death row, but it also is just, in my opinion, incredibly cruel and barbaric, and unfortunately continues. And I don't really have an answer for that part of your question, but I am always hopeful that we'll roll back and stop the death penalty in the United States. The overall reason, though, is what I would call the Willie Horton effect, which goes back to it was during a presidential campaign, and one presidential candidate, George Bush the first, ran a campaign ad against, I believe it was Michael Dukakis, for having let someone out of prison who then went on a bit of a violent crime rampage. And ever since then, politicians have been very reluctant to be anything but tough on crime. Like I said, hopefully we've seen a lot of change in the last couple of years, but that's what we've been fighting.
Can you tell me what you think, in your opinion, should be the priorities of reform, and where has the US criminal justice system already started to change, whether there are areas that are starting to head towards a more restorative, rehabilitative driven approach?
Well, I mean, I think we've seen a lot of kind of what I would say, a lot of important reforms, a lot of things that are happening all over the country. There's, 23 states have done all kinds of criminal justice reform over the last decade and seen crime continue to fall in all of those states. So we're seeing good results. We're seeing a lot of reform. But I think a lot of people have gotten some bad information. We can't really fix what's called mass incarceration in the United States without addressing the problem of violence and the problems of long and indeterminate sentences. People with long sentences are the beating heart of mass incarceration in the United States. A large number of people kind of cycle in and out, but the heart of the majority of people who stay in the system are people with long and indeterminate sentences. They're kind of the heart of everything that's wrong with our system. Until we change those things, nothing can really change. We have to move beyond the idea that there is no answer or no way to address violence without punishment. And we need to move towards healing and forgiveness. One of the reports you hear all the time when people do polling and interviews is that a lot of survivors of crime refuse to even report crimes because they don't want to subject themselves or even their perpetrators to what is fundamentally a cruel and unjust system. It isn't kind to people who have been survivors of crime, and it isn't kind to people who are going through the system. And if it's someone you know, even if you're incredibly angry with them, you don't necessarily want to put them through this. And I just want to be clear, you could and should, when most people talk about this stuff, they'll say something about we need to fix the system and get rid of marijuana arrests, or we need to get rid of private prisons. And both of those things would be great. I'm very opposed to the idea of arresting anyone for smoking marijuana. But I just want to be really clear here that you could end all marijuana arrests in the United States tomorrow, and you could close every private prison, which really they only hold about 8% of all people incarcerated in the United States, and it would have zero effect on mass incarceration. That isn't to say it isn't a bad idea. I mean, it isn't a good idea. But if we want to fix the problems, we really have to address different answers to the problem of violent crime and the problem of long and indeterminate sentences. That's what's really at the heart of mass incarceration in this country.
How do you think violent crime can be addressed most effectively?
Well, I think you're going to hopefully be talking about one of the really great ways in just a few minutes with our other guest, David, restorative justice. There's a great organization in the United States called Common Justice, where a person named Danielle Sered runs that organization. And because of a very forward-looking prosecutor, they're able to do restorative justice even in the cases of violent crime, which is one of the only places in the United States that does this. And as a result, they've had incredible results with very low recidivism rates and very good outcomes. And I think the reason things like that work is because it actually addresses cycles of trauma. It actually addresses trying to heal when someone goes to court, they get told that as a survivor of crime, they get told that the only answer they can get, the only healing they can get is from a guilty plea, a conviction, and someone being put in a prison and punished for a long time. That doesn't actually address the harm that's been done between the person who perpetrated the crime or the violent crime and the person who was harmed. And that's where real progress and healing needs to be made when possible. And so in my opinion, that's like one of the really important places that you can go. I think you also have to address a lot of the predicates. I think you have to look at that, the vast majority of people who commit violent crimes were also at some point either the victim of or the witness to other violent crimes. That trauma, in essence, creates more trauma. We have to address why people commit crimes, why people become violent, why trauma creates trauma, not just throw people in cages and assume that fixes the problem, because usually what ends up happening is, even accounting for that incapacitation, the experience of prison causes more crime than it prevents.
If anyone has questions for Josh, feel free to submit them in the Q&A section. We are having a few minutes that we can spend on a short Q&A with Josh, but if feel free to also submit questions later on, because Josh is gonna stick around with us till the end at our Q&A then. But of course, if you want to get more of this discussion right now, feel free to ask Josh anything. But in the meantime, whilst we're waiting for any questions from our audience, maybe Josh, could you elaborate on some racial disparities that you've witnessed in your time in prison?
Well, I mean, I think the main racial disparity in prison is the fact that you have predominantly people of color in prison, despite them being much less of a percentage of the population. There's certainly a lot of anecdotal examples. For instance, I remember in particular, I used to coach basketball in prison. And at one point during one season of the time when I was there, we had actual basketball seasons, we had leagues. One of the teams that I was coaching just happened, it was accidentally, to have 4 white guys on it. And all of a sudden we noticed that everybody on that a lot of the correctional officers were treating us a lot differently. And later they called us over and they let us know that it was because it was a white team, even though it wasn't a white team, it was a mixed team, but we just happened to have 4 white people on it. And, that's just one example of like a lot of little things you see all the time when you're going through the system, is kind of how actors in the system have certain biases that play out in the way that your day-to-day goes in prison. But mostly it's just noticing that that the majority of people in the United States are white, and the majority of people in prison in the United States are Black and Latino, and I mean that's a real problem in my opinion, humongous problem.
We have a question from a member of our audience asking, what is the best approach to shifting public opinion to the classic tough on crime narrative?
Well, I mean, I think I try very hard on on my podcast, through my work, doing things like this, to try to spread a different message, which is a message that every person has value, that healing is more important than punishment, that retributive justice doesn't result in good outcomes, that it creates a much less safe society, that it creates much more violence than it prevents. And I really am hopeful that, and I feel like over the last several years, I've been able to spread that message. And I think a lot of other people have too. We have a huge movement for criminal justice reform and for even more radical reform here in the United States that's growing leaps and bounds, especially in the last couple of months. And so I think that the idea is just to keep giving messages that humanize people, and to stop participating in discussions that reinforce tough on crime solutions and punishment solutions.
Brilliant. Someone is also asking, because we were discussing about racial disparities within prison. Could you tell us more a bit gender-related disparities, such as non-conforming queer inmates?
Yeah, when I was in a place called Mound Prison, I actually had a friend who was a trans woman who was in a male prison. And hearing her stories of just the brutality, she'd been in prison for, I think, 30 years, maybe. Something like that. It was a really long stretch. And just the stories of all the things that she'd been through in her time being a trans woman in a male prison. I mean, it was hard to listen to, and hard to not to just feel incredible empathy for her and her just resilience. I haven't talked to her in a while, but I hope she's doing well. And that was really tough. But gender on the, it's also, biological sex too. the way they created and constructed prisons was based on a biological male. It certainly wasn't based on trans people, and it certainly wasn't based on women or biological women. And so you have situations where most states in the United States have one prison that is for biological women. It's incredibly overcrowded and usually doesn't have a lot of the things that are necessities for women. And so part of the struggle here is a struggle for biological and trans women to be seen in a different way within our system as well. And that's a really it's a fight that a lot of people have engaged in. We have seen some very small changes, and we're hopeful that over time there will be a lot more consideration in United States corrections for these very real problems.
Okay, thank you. And finally, one more question with Josh. And this is more about how can young people can get involved in the fight for a fair criminal justice system in the US and anywhere else internationally. And also, where would you take your work next?
As for getting involved, I think the first and most important thing is to educate yourself. I'm not just an activist for criminal justice reform. I also spend, hours of every day reading research, reading the news, making sure I know that when I say something that I can back it up with facts, because in a lot of these conversations, if you come in and you suggest something that even to you doesn't seem particularly radical and seems fairly logical, all the forces that are aligned against you, all of the many actors who work in the system and want to preserve the system will really come at you pretty hard. And so you have to really be able to defend your point of view. And a lot of that requires educating yourself and reading a lot of research. Kind of the second step would be, I think, to really find out what organizations are on the ground doing good work where you live. Way too often people start with national organizations. Not that there's anything wrong with national organizations, but in your community, there are people who are working right now to make changes right around you with people you know and families you know. If you reach out to them, it's going to have a lot more direct impact on people. You're going to be able to have a lot more direct impact on people. So I would say start local and kind of then grow to national. As for what I'm up to, I've been working hard over the last year to help push a historic expungement package, which means clearing criminal records. Part of what I said earlier is that a lot of people go through, they do their time, and then they end up in a situation where it seems like nothing, not even death, will ever get them free of that crime they committed 10, 20, 30 years ago. And so what we've been working really hard to do is expand the ability for people to have their public records cleared here in Michigan so that they can go on and get jobs and get housing if they've been crime-free for a number of years. And so I'm very hopeful. We had that part of that package passed our Senate here in Michigan, or passed our Senate Judiciary Committee here in Michigan a few days ago. We're very hopeful that it'll pass the full Senate soon. It already passed the House, so we're getting very close to that. We're also doing a lot of work around reducing pretrial incarceration in our jails, and that work is starting to bear some fruits. So we're really a lot of good stuff is happening here. And I think it's happening all over the country. I think, it's a sad way for things to have to start happening. But what happened to George Floyd is really galvanized a lot of people who weren't a part of our movement, and they're becoming part of our movement in ways that they hadn't been before. And so it's a very sad way for that to have to happen. But hopefully it means that a lot of really serious change is coming. And I'm going to continue to try to tell stories and share information and break down these stereotypes. So, that's where I'm at.
Thank you for your insight, Josh. This will be the end of our interview with Josh, but also if you still have questions for him, he'll be sticking around throughout the remainder of the session. Now, since we've seen from a contextual perspective the effects of the current punitive-driven criminal justice system, hopefully David can shed light on an alternative approach and how it works both on a micro and a macro perspective.
We ready to go? We're good to go, yeah? Okay. Well, hello everyone again. My name is David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, founder, facilitator with Amplify RJ. This is going to be like a condensed version of some of the workshops I facilitate. Intro to RJ. If you go on amplifyrj.com, there's a link to a place where you can see all those workshops, but this is going to be like a condensed version of the lecture. There's also a version of this on the Amplify RJ YouTube channel. We're going to talk about this a little bit differently because we're a little bit more focused on drug policy, but there's also a link to some resources there as well. But I'm really excited to be here to share the ideas of restorative justice with you all. I want to invite us, before we keep going a little bit farther, and just to take a moment to breathe in the things that will help us focus and be present and be open to learning new ideas here, and exhale out distractions and worries, maybe closed-mindedness that is not going to serve us well in this space. I think taking a moment to do that is really important. A lot of the times we get so busy, caught up in the day-to-day hustle and bustle. Taking a moment to breathe is important. So thank you for doing that with me. A little bit more about myself. Like I said, my name is David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris. I am the descendant of people who immigrated to the United States from the Philippines and people who were imported as enslaved people from somewhere in West Africa. We don't know, hundreds of years ago. I use he, him pronouns, and I've been doing restorative justice work for about 5 years. Before that, I still am an X-ray tech, but I was also working in an employment program based out of a church. And what I was finding is that there were a lot of folks who were having a hard time finding work who had records in the criminal legal system. At the time, I didn't, I guess I knew that that was probably a thing, but doing that job, it became really clear to me that this was such a big problem. And so instead of thinking about, who are the felon-friendly employers, I started thinking about what are the root causes and how are these people ending up in this situation in the first place? It's not that they are necessarily bad people, right? It's that there were some circumstances that led them to being here, whether that is their family situations, but also the policies that exist within the country, right? So many people were locked up for using, possessing, or distributing drugs. And for me, I started thinking about why are we treating drug problems as if they are crimes instead of health problems. I think a really influential book for me at the time was Chasing the Scream, talking about the war on drugs. And so as I did more research around the war on drugs and mass incarceration, I learned about the school to prison pipeline leading to mass incarceration and the foster care to prison pipeline leading to mass incarceration, and people with mental health issues often being locked up instead of getting treatment. And so with all of these ideas swirling around, somewhere along the line, the word restorative justice came to my consciousness. And at the time, I thought it was simply an alternative to the punitive carceral system that we have. But over the years, I've learned that it's so much more. I'm originally from Southern California, but about this time I moved to Chicago, and I learned most about restorative justice in community. Many of you might be familiar with the practice of peace circles or talking circles, and that is a part of what restorative justice can be. Ora Shub, she passed away 2 years ago, was one of my first teachers in circle practice at Community Justice for Youth Institute. Cheryl Graves and Pamela Purdy there still continue that work. But I've had so many teachers along the way. Many people might know of Kay Pranis, who's done a lot of circle work. She was given circle practice by the Tagish people in Northern Canada. Miriam Kaba, it might be a name that's familiar to some of you who are more in the transformative justice space or community accountability space. She is a great follow on Twitter as well at US Prison Culture, I believe. And Tomas Ramirez is another elder who has taught me a lot of ceremonial indigenous ways of doing this work. And of course, there have been many other teachers along the way, but since then I've been doing work in Chicago in the legal system with community organizations and in education. But I moved out to Los Angeles last summer and was wanting to do restorative justice work. And I was finding that not a lot of people knew what the word meant, or they might have had like some kind of idea. But I started Amplify RJ as a platform to share with people about what this work was from a philosophy, practice, and values standpoint. So I started creating digital content on Instagram. That's where it started. If you want to follow amplify.rj on Instagram, we'd love to connect with you there. But also started offering interactive learning experiences, because so much of this, I guess there's a limit to what you can learn by reading or watching videos. You have to feel it, you have to practice it. So I've been offering interactive experiences for people to start learning and building a network of folks who are doing this work. There are a couple thousand people that I know in the US who are doing this work, but really wanting to make this well known. And so I'm really grateful for Yulia and the folks at SSDP for reaching out. So we're at this point where we're asking, what is restorative justice? This gentleman here, his name is Howard Zur, and he defined restorative justice in the 1990 book, Changing Lenses, as a process to involve, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense and to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. Howard was someone who was working in the late 70s and 80s as the drug war was starting to ramp up to figure out alternatives to that. And one of the ways that he was influenced was by the Maori people of New Zealand. Much like Black and brown people are disproportionately incarcerated in the United States, Maori people, again, who are indigenous to New Zealand are disproportionately incarcerated. And so Maori elders would go to the juvenile justice judges and say, hey, let us deal with these youth and these problems in our community using our traditions of dealing with harm and getting accountability. And they were finding that they were experiencing a lot lower rates of recidivism or repeat offending, right? And so along the way, Howard was like, we can bring some of those things here. He was also influenced by his Mennonite faith, leaders in the civil rights movement, and others, but the Maori people is largely where he was inspired. And so he wrote this book in 1990, and the work has grown a lot since then. Howard is who many in the West point to as the grandfather of restorative justice, but restorative justice practices, these philosophies, they're as old as all of our indigenous ancestors, right? When we lived in small groups of people, we had to figure out how to be together in community without throwing people away. We needed to heal harm. When we throw people away, when we kick them out of community, they're likely to die or go cause harm somewhere else or be harmed somewhere else. And so all of our ancestors really had this idea of interconnection at the center of all this work. And so when I think about restorative justice, I think about it as a philosophy instead of practices rooted in indigenous teachings that emphasize our interconnection by repairing relationships when harm occurs, while proactively building and maintaining relationships to prevent future harm. I'll say that again, restorative justice is a philosophy and set of practices rooted in indigenous teachings that emphasize our interconnection by repairing relationships when harm occurs, while proactively building and maintaining relationships to prevent future harm. We're going to go into some of that a little bit more in a moment, but I really appreciate the fact that, you know, the work has grown since Howard originally talked about it, and some people are using restorative justice or the word restorative justice in ways that are not all that restorative. Sometimes it's actually pretty punitive, but we're going to talk about the difference between what a restorative versus punitive approach means. So in general, there are three different ways. There might be more, but there are three different ways that I like to think about punitive versus restorative approaches. First, the questions. Fundamentally, of course, there's nuance to all of this, but fundamentally, a punitive approach asks, what rule or law was broken, who did it, and what punishment do they deserve? When we think about this, like just crime and punishment or rule breaking and punishment, that's how we get mandatory minimum sentencing. That's how we get crazy school suspensions, both like the war on drugs leading to mass incarceration, school to prison pipeline leading to mass incarceration, not helping anyone. With the restorative approach, we're asking what happened, who was impacted and how, and what needs must be addressed in order to make it right. We're much more focused on meeting the needs of folks involved than just punishing them. We also use different language, again, crime and punishment versus harm and repair, but I think Joshua spoke to this a little bit earlier, right? Using language that centers the person, so person who is harmed versus person who caused harm, not victim and perpetrator. We do this to center the person, right? Even though it's a little bit of a mouthful, we center the person, acknowledging that each person involved has unique needs and needs for support in their situation. No one is wholly defined by the worst thing that they've ever done, and no one is wholly defined just by a terrible thing that has happened to them. Using victim, perpetrator, or victim and offender language often dehumanizes folks, and we definitely want to center folks' humanity as we're focusing on the relationships that they have. Finally, for this punitive versus restorative piece, with a punitive approach, we're trying to control people's behavior using fear. So thinking that people will follow the rules because they're afraid of what will happen if they get caught. And we think about punishment as a deterrent. But people do things all the time that they know are illegal or against the rules. And so punishment really isn't a deterrent if the motivation for what they're doing is high enough, right? With a relationship-based approach, with a restorative motivation, we think about communities and relationships. So people will do things that will benefit their communities and not harm their communities because they want to be in good relationship. And punishment, if we think about it, just causes more harm. A lot of the times when we think about punishment, we think about taking people out of their communities, whether that is like a school suspension or a timeout for a child or like incarceration. We're removing people from their communities where, one, they are, like Josh was saying, they are actively being harmed in prison. Prison is violent, jail is violent, and they are not getting any of their needs met. Furthermore, they're being stripped away of their community connections, the people who can support them or could support them in getting some of their needs met, helping support them heal the harm that they caused or meet the needs that caused them to do things that were harmful. We can go on and on about that. And I think Josh did a pretty good job of explaining like why prison is inherently violent and the criminal legal system is inherently violent. But we are also taking them away from the community where they were contributing in some ways. While they might have been harming folks in one space, they were a contributing member of society in another place. And the person who was harmed in a situation is only temporarily safe, right? Most people who are incarcerated eventually get out. And so the community isn't really safe if there's nothing being done inside of jail or prison walls to quote unquote rehabilitate or help support the person. And Josh also laid out how when people come out of incarceration, there are so few resources and there's so much stigma around that. So punishment really does just cause more harm, especially when we think about incarceration. And one of the things that I like to tease out is like a lot of times people think that like, we need consequences, we need discipline. And the word consequences and the word discipline do not mean punishment. Consequences, if we're being like very technical about it, comes from the Latin word consequent. Really, it just means to follow. So anything that happens after an action is a consequence of that action, right? I think about natural consequences versus chosen responses. So because I'm looking at the lovely Yulia right now in the bottom of my screen, if I was to punch Yulia in the face, my hand would hurt. That's the natural consequence. Her face would hurt. Her feelings would be hurt. She wouldn't want to be in relationship with me. And I would probably feel some kind of way too. Those are the natural consequences. Anything that we choose to do after that is a chosen response. And that response can be punitive. She could decide she wanted to call the police and press charges. She could decide to ignore it. She could decide to try to work it out and like figure out, why in the world did you just punch me in the face? I thought we were cool. Anything that follows that is a consequence, and it's a chosen response. Similarly with discipline, when we think about the word discipline, the root of it comes from the Latin discipulus, which is for pupil, right? We think about the disciples of Jesus, and it's really a way to think about training or instructing or teaching or a field of study, not necessarily punishment and control. It's been used to think about that since like in the 13th century, people were thinking about self-control, self-flagellation in a religious nature, but that's not the origin of the word. And so when we think about the words consequences and discipline, these are just responses. These are just ways of being. And I like to use this social discipline window. It's not a perfect example, but I appreciate what Paul and Ted did here, thinking about high support and high discipline being a place where we want to be restorative, right? Doing things with people, not to people without support, not for people without discipline, or just totally ignoring the situation altogether. That's not really helpful for anybody. With each of these approaches, they're often easier and faster, but we're not really solving the problems and getting needs met. But we function in all of those spaces often for multiple reasons. And so restorative justice and restorative approaches to harm are often what is really going to solve problems, but it takes a little bit more work. It takes a little bit of creativity. And we're going to talk about, we're going to explore a little bit more about what that looks like. Next slide. So one of the things that I want us to think about are the feelings that people have when they cause harm, and the needs that people have, the feelings and needs people have both when they are harmed and when they cause harm. So for the sake of, this is normally an interactive activity, but for the sake of us being live streaming, I want you to think about a time when someone caused you harm. What were the feelings that you had after it happened, and what did you need after it happened? I'm gonna share a couple stories. For me, when I was, let's go back to 8th grade, 2002. I was on the phone with my friend, and we started talking about this girl in our class. And he was like, "So what do you think of this person?" And I was like, "Oh my gosh, she is so cute. She's beautiful. She's smart. She's funny. I want to date her." And little did I know that I wasn't just having a conversation with my bro. It was a three-way call, and he was on the phone with me, but he had her on the other line listening to the whole thing. And so in that moment, I felt betrayed. I was angry. I was sad. I was disappointed in my friend. I was confused why he would do this. I felt all those things. And what I needed was, I needed a good friend who wouldn't do that to me. I needed reassurance that I needed reassurance that maybe those feelings were reciprocated, or I needed to know where she stood. I needed closure. I needed understanding why he would do something like that. I needed support from someone else who would be there for me and not do me dirty like that. I think about another time when I was a college student. My hair was just as long as it is now. It's not as nice. It wasn't as nicely up in a bun as it is right now. Let's take it down. It's beautiful. But when my hair is down like this, right? I was biking to school and wearing a helmet, safety first. I got to school and my hair was all crazy because helmet hair, right? I walked into my professor's office and we were having a conversation, and I hadn't stopped in the restroom to clean up. And my program director walked into the office, or walked by the office, and said, "Hey, you need to get a haircut now." And in that moment, I felt belittled, angry, shocked, confused, embarrassed, shame. And I needed for them to say, like, be more understanding of the situation. Like, hey, just go clean up, not get a haircut, like pull your hair back, not get a haircut. I needed somebody to stand up for me and say, like, hey, that's wrong. You need to like that's not an appropriate thing to say. There are lots of things that I needed. And so maybe you're thinking of a situation and you're having similar feelings. When I do this exercise, I often hear the questions, I often hear a bunch of these feelings, right? Anger, rage, annoyance, frustration, betrayal, mistrust, shock, confusion, disappointment, let down, drained, exhausted, embarrassed, shame, scared, worry, fear, guilt, remorse, regret, hopeless, helpless, hurt, pain, lonely, isolated, left out, numb, overwhelmed, stressed, resentful, sad, unappreciated, unseen, vulnerable, fragile, withdrawn. And things that people often need are acceptance, belonging, inclusion, acknowledgement of the harm, an apology, autonomy, or a choice of what to do moving forward, comfort, reassurance and support, communication, explanation for what happened, and understanding, a sense of community and connection, confidentiality, privacy, empathy, forgiveness of self, having the harm stop, honesty, not being defined by this, no future harm, rebuilding trust, respect from others and self, both physical and emotional safety, time and space to process and reflect, validation of feelings, needs, and perspective. There's so much that we need. Of course, not in every situation, but those needs are very real. And as we switch our way of thinking about the needs that folks might have and the feelings that folks might have when they cause harm, you might see, well, we'll see. When I think about a time when I caused harm, I did not change that slide, but when I think of a time when I caused harm, I think about, two different examples. One, we can go back to elementary school days. I was in second grade and we were playing at recess. The end of recess came, the whistle blew, and it was time to go inside. But I wanted one more turn on the monkey bars. My friends and I had been racing across the bars, seeing who could do it the fastest. And my friend was standing on top of the bars, but wasn't really moving or going. And so I asked them to move. I asked them again, I said it louder. And when they didn't move, I pushed them and they fell and they broke their leg. In that moment, I was feeling scared. I was sad that I hurt my friend. I was shocked that that happened. I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. I was disappointed in myself. I needed an adult to come and comfort me and tell me that 7-year-old David, you're not a monster for breaking your friend's leg. You're not a bad person. You made a mistake. You can do something to make this better. You can help them out and support them in ways that you can. So I needed support and guidance as well as comfort. I needed to apologize. I needed to learn patience. I needed to understand that it was when the whistle blows, it's time to go inside. I think about another time, and it was March 8th of this year. And I remember it was March 8th because that is International Women's Day. And I was in a training with Miriam Kaba. And Miriam Kaba, amazing person, doing the work. And it was organized by a bunch of women and femmes, and the room was mostly women, femmes, and non-binary people. There were very few cisgender men in the room. And I was talking to the guys at lunch and was saying, hey, y'all, we need to say something to acknowledge the work that all these women did to organize this. And they were like, that sounds like a great idea, David. Go for it. And I was like, fine, it was my idea. I will say something. So at one of the breaks, I got up and said a little piece about how we appreciated the women for organizing this event and holding down this work largely. And a lot of the women in the room appreciated that. And somebody who identified as non-binary came up to me during that break and said, hey, I felt totally erased by the way that you said that. And I was looking around the room and making eye contact with the non-binary and the trans folks in the room. And we were just like, what the heck is happening? And so when I heard that in the moment, I felt honestly a little bit defensive, but then like disappointed in myself, embarrassed, shame. I felt sad that I had heard that. I felt kind of angry with myself as well. And I needed guidance on how to word that better. I needed to apologize. I needed to do better moving forward. I needed language to better articulate my ideas. So you might have heard some similarities between like the things that I felt and needed, right? When we think about the things that we need when we cause harm and the things that we feel when we cause harm, they are very, very similar to the things that we feel and need when we are harmed. And what I think this says about harm and restorative justice and this work in general is that first, punitive approaches to justice don't meet any of these needs that people have. Maybe you can make an argument for time and space, and you can make an argument for the harm stopping temporarily, but it's not really solving the problem. The criminal legal system is so adversarial. It gives people who cause harm no incentive to be remorseful or apologetic. It is most advantageous to just deny. So you're not going to get punished or get in trouble. And what we really need is accountability, acknowledgement of the harm, changed behavior. And if people don't have the skills to change that behavior, getting the support to build those skills to do that, so we can address these needs that both we as people who cause harm and we, when we are people who are harmed, have. And what I appreciate about like having this up here is that, you know, looking at the feelings and needs, I told stories from when I was a child and when I was an adult. We all have these feelings, no matter who we are, no matter where we are. Restorative justice is not just this thing for kids in school or adults who commit crimes. This is a framework for navigating the world when we both cause harm and when we are harmed, but also for building relationships across the board. I think I like using the metaphor of the tree that Yulia referenced a little bit earlier, because I think when people think about restorative justice practices, they just think about the process where we're asking what happened, who was impacted and how, and what needs must be addressed in order to make it right. But just like the branches of the tree need to be supported by a strong trunk and need to be rooted in like a solid foundation in order to produce fruit and leaves, right? Restorative justice processes need to be supported by proactive restorative practices rooted in restorative mindset and values in order to get to these outcomes of healing, accountability, relationships that are in the metaphor are the fruit and leaves of the tree. So we're going to break this down just a little bit. Broad overview. This is intro level. There is next level learning that I do offer in workshops. So if you want to head over to the website, you can check out those dates. But starting with a restorative justice mindset, I appreciate this list that was compiled by Carolyn Boyce Watson and Kay Pranis. These are derived from and built on from Indigenous teachings and other wisdom traditions. And as you're listening, I want to invite you to reflect on the one that really stands out to you. I'm going to read them all aloud, but as you listen, think about the one that really stands out to you and think about what it would mean for you to fully embody this in your life, especially when it comes to harm. The true self in everyone is good, wise, and powerful. The world is profoundly interconnected. All human beings have a deep desire to be in a good relationship. All humans have gifts, and everyone is needed for what they bring. Everything we need to make positive change is already here. Human beings are holistic, and we need practices to build habits of living from the core self. If you fully embodied one of those assumptions, how different would you navigate the world, especially in the way that you encounter and address harm. Out of these assumptions, I came up with some of these values. Of course, these are not all of the values that can be restorative. These are the values that I find important when doing this work. Just like my definition of restorative justice is not the only definition of restorative justice, these are not the values that are restorative, but I want to highlight a couple. One, equity. We live in a society that oppresses people for all sorts of reasons: gender, sex, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, ability, disabilities, religion, education, and race intersects with all of those. And I think in this moment, it's really important to emphasize that racial justice is at the center of restorative justice. You have to be anti-racist. You have to be working towards being anti-racist in order to do restorative justice work. This idea of multiple truths intersects with this, where we're talking about everybody who is impacted by a situation. And really, that's everybody in the world. If we think about this in the large view, coming to this work with their own assumptions, their own biases, their own past experiences. And those are valid. Those are our own lived experiences. Excuse me, but we have to be able to come together and start from somewhere, even if some of our experiences and actions and perspectives are harmful to others. We're not absolving people of that, but we need them to come to the table as they are in order to move forward together, and still holding them accountable for the harm that their actions cause. Like good intent does not excuse like poor impact or harmful impact, but we need everybody to be able to start somewhere. Again, one of the things that I want to highlight again is this idea of interconnection. I talked about it earlier, how so many indigenous cultures have this idea of interconnection like at their center. For me, when I think back to my ancestors, my Filipino ancestors and my African ancestors, a couple words come to mind. I'm Filipino, and so the word Tagalog, in Tagalog, kapwa is this idea of togetherness, brotherhood. And if you go to Babayan, the pre-colonial language of the Philippines, it's this deep interconnection between the inner self and all beings, really similar to the word Ubuntu that people in Southern Africa use, right? This idea of I am because you are, or I am because we are. A person is only a person through another person. We're so connected. I think about words that are used here in the land that we call the United States, Metaquiasan by the Lakota. We are all relatives in the land that is Mexico and Central America. The Mayans used the word or the phrase in Lakech, Alaken, I am another you, you are another me. Words like namaste get to this idea as well. These words exist across all indigenous cultures. And because of colonization, because of global capitalism, well, first because of colonization, they were stripped away from us. We were tried to be further, they were removed from the lexicon. In a lot of contexts, Christianity was stuffed down the throats of people. And so we were removed from that kind of spirituality. But now global capitalism has us even farther removed from that. There is a white normalcy that a lot of us are brought up in, and it is more individualistic, not collective. And we are more and more divorced from this idea of interconnection. And if we really thought about people who cause harm as being another one of us, we would not be incarcerating them at the rates that we were doing them, and we wouldn't be treating them with incarceration at all, probably, right? I think there is space for people to be removed or put in a different place in community so they can heal and get their needs met. We think about, going back to the feelings and needs, people who cause harm have needs too. People who people who are harmed have needs, and the community can address some of those. They don't have to be in the same place to have those needs addressed, but they can in some instances. It's not necessarily mandatory. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight here is self-determination, autonomy. People need to be able to voluntarily participate in these processes. You can't mandate someone to do this work that is really introspective and internal. It has to be a choice that people are making. And so if this was a little bit more interactive, I would say, like, what are your values that bring you into this work? Maybe you can type those in the chat and we can review them later. But just something to think about as we move on up the tree. The thing that I think about most with restorative justice and this idea of interconnection is that restorative justice is about relationships. And the first relationship you have is the relationship with yourself. Doing this work means that you have to take care of yourself. Remember, we're holistic beings, 2 slides back, right? Human beings are holistic. We have spiritual, mental, physical aspects to ourselves that we need to attend to in order to show up in the best way doing this work. We can't pour into others if we're on empty. And then the internal work side of this is the work that it takes to live up to these values, these assumptions. Again, going back 2 slides, we need practices to build habits of living from the core self. This is not just a box that we can check. This is constant work that we need to do to show up in ways that are helping people, that are acknowledging the humanity in the other, challenging our assumptions and biases that we grew up with, so we can focus on the humanity and the interconnection that we have with other folks. Creating collaborative agreements is a great way to make sure that you're getting clear on what's expected of you and what you expect out of others, preventing misunderstanding, preventing conflict, preventing harm. Checking in is also a great practice for making sure that the needs in the community are being met. You can build relationships, you can celebrate, you can get to know folks. When you know someone, you're a lot more likely to want to help them. You're a lot less likely to cause them harm. And if there is harm, you're a lot more likely to want to repair the relationship. Communication for connection is this really broad term that addresses the way that we both talk, listen, the words that we say, the tone that we use, all the nonverbals, making sure that we're building relationships, not alienating people, not judging people, not dismissing people. And I have talking circles on here because talking circles are a practice that are very closely associated with restorative justice. You might know them as peace circles or healing circles, and they are their own practice, rooted in their indigenous ceremonies. And oftentimes I see people using talking circles or saying that they're doing talking circles, thinking that they're necessarily doing restorative justice, where they may not necessarily be doing that. I don't want to go too far into depth with that, but I want to make sure folks know that talking circles are ceremonies that were passed down to me through indigenous folks in what the land that is now Canada and the United States. And a lot of the times when we try to bring them into Western context, like the contextualization often turns into co-opting and appropriating. So there's a very fine line. We can definitely do a lot of things in healing circles that are restorative, whether that's building community, celebrating, grieving, healing, and also resolving conflict, addressing harm. But I'm very careful about talking about talking circles when it comes to restorative justice, especially the way that the world is now. But moving up the tree, like I said, talking circles can be restorative. They can be a part of the restorative process. And the restorative process is essentially where we're asking the questions, what happened, who's affected and how, and what needs must be met to make this right. Of course, there's more nuance to that in going through that process, but this can happen in the format of a conversation between folks or a mediated conversation in a circle using that ceremony, or in a conference setting where groups of people are coming together, both the person who is impacted, the person who was harmed, other people who support them, or other people who are impacted, to decide how we can all meet the needs of the people involved, right? It's not just the responsibility of the person who caused harm. It's not just the responsibility of the person who was harmed. The community also has a role to play in this healing. And so when we think about the outcomes of restorative justice, we are talking about healing harm. We're talking about building and maintaining relationships. We're talking about accountability. I think the healing and relationships part can come through those proactive practices, right? But the accountability part gets added on to healing and relationships when we go through the restorative process. And again, accountability being harm being acknowledged, behavior changing. And if folks don't have the skills to change the behavior on their own, supporting them in building those skills to change the behavior. To complete the metaphor of the tree, I like to think about the leaves as outcomes that impact the individual, right? Leaves photosynthesize light and feed the individual, feed the tree. And the fruit feeds other animals, nourishes the earth when it falls and decomposes, helps to grow and pollinate other trees. And so those are the outcomes that feed other folks. And so friends, that's the overview of the restorative justice tree. And you may be thinking to yourself, what does this have to do with drug policy? And I think there's a couple ways where this intersects, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more with the question and answer. First of all, restorative justice is an individual practice. So like, what are the things that you are internalizing about drug policy, and like what the role of drugs and laws are? What are the things that you need to change inside yourself to think about how you are thinking about people who use drugs, who sell drugs? What are the ways that you can educate yourself on what the actual stories of folks are, the history of how drug policy was constructed? And then we can start to think beyond ourselves, right? Institutionally, maybe first interpersonally, and then institutionally and systemically, right? In order to change, I appreciate Josh talking about like, educate yourself. And we need to know the real history behind things, not just the things that are taught to us in history books or things that are like for public consumption in popular culture and popular media. Learning from folks who are actually very close to this work, who have experienced this, is a great way to do that relationship building, along with re-education. And when we're thinking about changing policy, following the lead of the people who are most affected by this is the way that we're going to prevent even further harm from happening. And I'm always a fan of reparations. When there has been harm, we need to acknowledge it. Yes, we need to change the policy, but we also need to help heal the people who have been harmed. And so reparations could look like a lot of things. One of the things that I think about here in the US is where there are attempts at giving people who have been incarcerated for selling cannabis, preferential treatment for licensure, for the same things that all these white-led corporations are doing and making a ton of profit off of. That's one thing, but it can look like a lot of different things. So you might be wondering to yourself, what can I do next? I don't know if we want to save this for after, Yulia. We might want to do that after. So I think this might be a good time to shift to the question and answer. I'm going to go get a sip of water. I don't know if you want to vamp for a little bit, but I will be right back.
Thank you, David. This has been very informative. It has shed light on ways we can implement restorative justice in our personal life and how it works in criminal justice. And I think the most fundamental lesson of all of this is that restorative justice is not something that is completely isolated and exclusive to the criminal justice system. It is something that affects us in daily life, and it is our choice how we respond to things that are happening around us. For anyone who has joined us via live streaming, if you want to take part in the Q&A, do register via Eventbrite, because that's an option exclusive to our attendees that have registered on Eventbrite. Also, we will be trying to think about this idea of a restorative justice tree from a harm reduction drug policy perspective. So if attendees would like to share their perspectives over things related to harm reduction that are sort of belong to restorative mindsets and values. So the roots of the restorative justice tree, the trunk, what kind of restorative justice practices are present when we're thinking about harm reduction policies, as well as branches, the ways we can contribute in our own communities to change perspectives. And of course, outcomes, restorative outcomes within the harm reduction. So do please engage with that in the chat, and we can talk more with David and Josh about that. So we're waiting for David to come back.
I'm here.
Josh is here. That's good. That's good. And David is here as well.
Yeah.
Okay, we're good. So David and Josh as well, how do you think this tree framework would work from a harm reduction perspective? What do you think are the kind of mindsets that would be at the roots of a restorative approach in harm reduction?
I guess I can start off with that. I mean, I think, first of all, when we're thinking about harm reduction, like, it's important to center people and like, what are the needs of people, right? And like, think, another way to like summarize what restorative justice is like meeting the needs of people in whatever way they need to be addressed, right? And so a lot of these assumptions, right, get to that, the acknowledgement of our interconnection, right? Like, what's beneficial for you is beneficial for me, and so I'm going to do whatever it takes to benefit you, like specifically, like, there's no use in like sticking to laws just because they're laws, when it's actively harming other members of my community, right? And in turn, like, if we think about it, like, simply dollars and cents, the amount of money that it takes to like lock somebody up versus the amount of money it takes someone to get treatment or like run a needle exchange program, right? Or to do any number of other interventions other than incarceration. Just from that perspective alone, it's more beneficial for me as someone who is interconnected, like, capitalistically in society through economics. Like, that is just better. But I also come at it from like the humanity of this person is using because they need, they have other needs that they are trying to get met, and I want to do whatever I can to help meet those.
Yeah, definitely. I think acknowledging the humanity of drug users is key to a restorative mindset in harm reduction. Josh, would you like to add on that with some suggestions in terms of what kind of restorative mindsets are present when we're thinking about drugs?
Well, I mean, I think the important thing is that trying to discipline or punish addiction or drug use out of someone is not a way to come back into harmony with someone. It's not a healing practice. I mean, we deal with harm reduction ideas in criminal justice reform all the time. Just the other day, I was having an argument online with someone about the need to look at Suboxone as a treatment as opposed to as an illegal substance in prisons. And the idea that, there was a story about a bunch of people running a drug ring in prison the other day in Michigan. And my response was, it's just like on the outside, if you arrest or punish the people running that ring, that's not going to stop drugs from being in prisons. It's not going to stop demand. It's not going to stop supply. And all you're going to end up doing is hurting more people. And what we really need to do is have a harm reduction approach. We need to do things to reduce the, to really step back and try to let people deal with their needs, as David just put it, and heal in their own ways. We need to really stop just using punishment as a solution to these things.
Thank you for your insight, Josh. I was thinking, going on from that, we know that there is a clear distinction between punishment and consequences. I was thinking, how does accountability work from a restorative justice perspective? How do you guys think it can be implemented, especially when we're talking about harm reduction, given that people sort of are afraid of decriminalizing, for example, cannabis, because they fear it might spike the number of drug users, it might increase crime. So if you could maybe shed light on that and how accountability works from a restorative perspective, that would be great.
I guess I'll go.
Well, you're the restorative expert. I'm just
experienced person, always learning. I think I laid out the framework for accountability being as like, the harm is acknowledged, the behavior changes, and like there's skill building involved if the behavior doesn't need, if somebody isn't capable of changing behavior on their own. I think of my friend whose son was riding their bike where they were not supposed to earlier this month, and they they're 12 years old. So they tried to ride their bike down 30 flights of stairs, right? And they crashed and broke their teeth and had a concussion. The natural consequences of that were plenty accountability for that person to learn like what not to do and change their behavior and acknowledge the harm that like he caused to himself, but also to his mom and his family. And so like, what is the need for punishment in that situation? He learned, right? I think accountability is kind of like just back like to what we were saying about restorative justice, like meeting the needs of folks involved in that situation. So when we think about people who are using drugs, right, they are trying to meet a need for themselves, right? And that might come in conflict with the needs that other people have for safety. And I want to make the distinction between the needs of safety versus comfort. Like I need to be safe driving. And so I don't want somebody who is under the influence of anything driving next to me. That is a safety thing. But if someone is on a park bench smoking a joint, like I am not unsafe because of that. I might be uncomfortable with that, but I'm not unsafe. And so like we need to really think about like what our needs are, safety versus like uncomfortability. And like I think another piece of this is people need to be educated on like what effects of drugs are often. Like I think in the United States, like DARE was very harmful, right? Like it just scared people and caused a lot of people who, you know, didn't know anything about drugs and like all drugs are bad. Anyone who uses drugs is a bad person, right? And we need to be re-educated about like what the effects of using drugs are and the reasons that people do drugs. Yeah. Did you want to add anything onto that, Josh?
Yeah. I want to problematize this a little bit because I would ask the question, where is the accountability in our system now? Mm-hmm. There's not a step in the process that I went through, and I did, 3 years in prison, where I was asked to be accountable, except during the parole process, which is not related necessarily to my sentence. So when I was being arrested, no one asked me to be accountable. When I was being sentenced, no one asked me. They imposed accountability on me, but they didn't ask for me to be accountable. They didn't ask for me to take responsibility for what I did. They imposed a sentence on me. And while I was in prison, no one was asking me to be accountable. There was no time in which I was in any kind of concert with the people that I'd harmed. There was no attempt at healing them. There was no attempt at healing, what was wrong with me. So, I would ask the question, what about our system is about accountability now? Now, there are a lot of things you can do to be accountable. I can personally take responsibility for what I've done, and I can try to be accountable for it and try to live in a way that works against harm, in our communities. And that's what I think I try to do. But I don't think our system now generates accountability. I think it imposes a substitute for accountability from outside onto people.
Yeah, that punitive approach, like doing things to people, not really forcing. Like punishment is so easy. You can just take it, right? You don't have to do anything. And you take your licks and then you come out not having, maybe you've thought about what you did and maybe you figure out like how you want to change, but it's not necessary. It's not necessary to the process. Thanks for highlighting that, Josh.
Oh, also a story David told about being in the room with all the different identifying people. I did want to apologize for saying biological sex instead of cisgender earlier. I don't know what happened when I was saying that. I apologize for that.
Thank you. Thank you for the insight. We will entertain one more question from our attendees. So if anyone wants to shoot a question now is the time. Otherwise, I can also ask you guys about the idea of discipline and how discipline, because we associate the idea of discipline with law and order and punitive approaches. How do you think this concept sort of changes? How do you think it takes shape from a restorative perspective?
I mean, David is the expert in this area, but I personally don't think that there is anything restorative about the idea of discipline. I think that most change comes from within, and that it's a process of your own investigation of your own of the harm you've caused and why you caused it. And for me, at least, reflection on my own process of how I got to where I was and the harm that I'd done was the most important thing. I don't think any of the kind of external disciplining kind of things had anything to do with the change in me or in what happened with me post incarceration.
Yeah, I think you shared that like that was something that like you did yourself, and like you could have had support and people supporting you. And so like when we go back to that diagram, can I share my screen again? Let's go. Oops. Let's go back to this diagram, right? Like so much of punishment, when we think about like just like disciplining people in the context of like discipline being punishment, like we talked about like why that's not the case, but like discipline being punishment, we're doing things to people and like they don't have to do anything. Like that's what we're talking about, like incarcerating somebody, right? But when we're talking about doing things with people, we're allowing them to like do things for themselves, right? And supporting them in ways that they need to be supported. So again, like I like reframing discipline as just like a way to teach. You can teach yourself for sure, like Josh was saying, and you can get support in doing that. But like equating discipline with punishment is like, I know it's like, it's hard to reclaim words, but like I would love to be able to reclaim discipline just to this idea of to teach and how we go about teaching people, how we go about helping people navigate different situations. It doesn't have to be this thing where like we're just doing something to you. We can be working together, getting you the support that you need in order to do that. I think Josh is right. Like you can only be accountable to yourself. Really, at the end of the day, no one can force accountability on you, but people can help create the conditions for you to do that work for yourself or participate in that work for yourself.
I do think part of the process has to be interior, because to be able to hear other people, you have to open yourself to hearing, I think, in a lot of ways. And, for instance, someone in the chat was the one that tipped me to the fact that I'd kind of stumbled over how I described that situation in prison with trans folks. And I could have immediately responded in a defensive manner, but because I saw it as support, and not as discipline, and I was open to the idea of listening to other people to try to make sure I was saying things the right way. I think, I was much more open to it and willing to move forward. I don't know. I guess you're right. It's how you define the word discipline is probably.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you guys for your insights. It has been truly a very resourceful conversation. We unfortunately have run out of time. So if anyone has any questions or would like to get involved further with either the Decarceration Nation, Amplify RJ, and attend their workshop, listen to their podcast, please follow them on Instagram at Decarceration Nation and at Amplify RJ. We also have one message. Okay, yes, thank you guys. Thank you guys for attending this workshop on restorative justice. We hope you learned something about it and you will be able to incorporate these principles in your daily lives and not only sort of keep it restrained to the criminal justice system. If you want to get involved with SSDP, do follow us on our Facebook page, SSDP UK Network, where you can find the latest updates with our activities, our advocacy, and also do get involved with your local chapter or contact us if you want to start a new chapter in the UK. We're more than open to support you. Start your drug policy advocacy journey and also your restorative justice journey, because after all, our work in drug policy is rooted in restorative justice, and harm reduction is inherently an approach, a restorative justice approach. So thank you again for attending. Thank you again, Josh and David, for agreeing to be part of this panel. And we will see you guys very soon.